Hey everybody, this is Jason. I've been talking for 7 minutes and it turns out none of you were here. So now that you're here and that I'm here, I'm going to start over again and welcome you to Copperworks. I'm Jason, the president of Copperworks Distilling. What we're going to be talking about today is peated whiskey. We've just released our very first release of whiskey made from peat from Washington State. And so what's interesting about that is a whole bunch of things that I want to dive into. I want to start by telling you a little bit about what peat is, and then I'm going to tell you how we made it. So the very first thing to know is that peat is actually the product called peat. The thing called peat is basically decayed vegetation. And where it comes from is any of a myriad of different plants that are growing near water, either near a lake, on a lake, or in a lake. So it could be something that's floating on top, it could be something that's growing from the bottom of the lake up in a shallow lake, or it could be sedges and other plants that are growing on the side of the lake. Interesting thing about this is that plants, let's just think about a common one for making peat is sphagnum moss. When moss is growing, it holds water. When that moss dies, the dead moss is on the bottom and new moss grows on top, and it continues to hold water. That water is keeping that dead moss from receiving oxygen because it's covered in a layer of water. And so it doesn't rot, it just sits there. More moss dies and new moss grows on top of that, creating a thicker bed of moss. Every year, every decade, every millennia, moss builds up thicker and thicker and thicker. Eventually, the weight of moss and water on top press that layer on the bottom so thick that it almost becomes fibrous, sort of like a particle board, right? So what's forming in the lake bottom and on the lake edges is this layer of organic material that would have rotted if it had not been underwater, but since it was underwater, it doesn't rot, and instead it carbonizes. Think about what would eventually become coal, but in this case just is a lot less burned than that. So this product is available at as a matter of fact, 2% of the world's earth surface is covered in peat bogs. So it's everywhere. It's in the Andes, it's down to the lowlands, and it's everywhere in between. It turns out that Washington State has about 300 plus, maybe even as many as 400 peat bogs just in our state. I still want to talk a little bit more about how the peat is generated, and then we're going to talk about where the peat from Washington came from. So when that peat is crushing the peat below it, and you have layers of peat, fresh peat on top, maybe only a couple of 100 years old, peat in the middle that may be 1,000 or more years old, and then peat on the bottom that's several thousand or even 10,000 years old. Those layers of peat will have different flavors. It's a continuum, and the stuff on the bottom will actually be the most compressed and have the least flavor. It's going to be almost like I mentioned, particle board. As you get up closer to the top, you're going to have more sticks and more leaves that still, when they burn, add more flavor. So somewhere in between is where you might want to mine peat. In Scotland and in Ireland, a lot of the bogs are now dry. That means that for a good part of the year, you can actually walk right onto them, and using a special type of shovel, you can actually dig up part of that peat and dry it out, and then use that as a heat source. Now, traditionally, peat was used for a heat source. It was used to heat your houses, it was used to cook, and it was also used to dry barley that was going to be turned into whiskey. But in modern days, especially in America, peat isn't used as a heat source. It actually still is in certain places in Scotland and Ireland. But most of it is used now for either gardening, because it's great for water retention, we already talked about that, or for smoking and flavoring malt. In order to flavor, you have to burn it so that it smokes. So you can't get flavor, even though it's a very romantic story to hear that water running through peat is used in the distillery and that becomes the gentle flavor of peat. That's a great idea, but that's not the way it works. The way it works is peat has to be burned. And when it's burned in an inefficient manner, so not to make heat, but instead to make maximum amount of smoke, that smoke comes up through the grain. When it's wet, it adheres to the grain. It actually sticks into the husks of the barley kernel as it's drying. And that's where the flavor comes from. So you always have to use the wet malt, not after it's been kiln dried, then smoke it. That's not where peat gives its flavor to malt. It's during the wet phase. You then take that malt and make whiskey out of it. So we've run several of these Instagram Live stories that you can learn about how we do brewing. You can learn where malt comes from. But let's talk about where Washington peat comes from. So I already mentioned that there's quite a few Washington bogs. Most of them, thankfully, are protected wetlands. That's a very good thing. That means that we're going to be able to keep our runoff from roads and parking lots and neighborhoods going into the watershed, and that peat bog helps mitigate that rapid flow of water. However, there are certain times when a peat bog is either already commercially mined or it's been available because there's peat around it and there's no runoff. And this is the case down in Shelton, Washington, where there is peat underneath a small lake that can be mined. Now remember, in Scotland and in Ireland, they're usually walking out onto the moors and they're digging that peat up. Here, because it's underwater, it needs to be mined with a backhoe. Remember us talking about the layers of peat? So you actually dig through several layers of peat. You're digging through the top, the middle, even perhaps the bottom of that peat, and pulling all of that up, including all the muck that might be on top of the lake bottom. That has to be rinsed off. The mud goes away. The peat is piled. It's dried. It takes a while to actually get the water to just seep out of it. And then pelletized. For this batch, all of that peat was run through a pelletizer, the type of thing that would make wood pellets for wood pellet stoves. All you Traeger owners out there would know what I'm talking about. You take that and blow that smoke that is coming through a pellet stove into the drying malt. Westland, so Matt Hoffman, the master distiller at Westland, came up with this idea about the same time Copperworks was opening. We opened in 2013. Matt had been making whiskey for 3 years before that and had been thinking, hey, I wonder where peat is. Did a Google search, found the same things that you can find. If you go out to Google and you search peat in Washington State, you'll find some really great reports. Some of them from around 1958 that do a full survey of all of the peat bogs that were known at that time in Washington State. And lo and behold, one of them, the one in Shelton, was available. So Westland negotiated to get that wet peat up to Skagit Valley Malting. They're the ones that came up with the method to pelletize it and blow it into blow the smoke into the wet malt. That wet malt then was delivered both to Westland and to Copperworks. We then had to distill with it. Now, brew it and distill with it. There's a lot of things we were trying to do. When we were brewing and distilling, we wanted to make sure we didn't lose any of the flavors that were coming out. Although you always lose the flavors from the peat along the process. But we wanted to brew in a way that would reduce that. So we always boil to sanitize. That's, by the way, something that most distilleries don't do. Again, for a little bit more on that, you can listen to the talk about brewing at Copperworks. But we always boil to sanitize. This time we limited that boil to just enough minutes, 15 minutes, in order to do a sanitary boil. That kept all of those flavors from going up the stack of the brew kettle. We then took that beer back here. We pitched brewer's yeast into it. We did a 7-day fermentation, a 2-week conditioning. We actually did a 3-week conditioning. We wanted to make sure that all the yeast dropped out. The beer that resulted was super delicious and very smoky. It reminded me of a Scotch ale. Back when I was at the Pike Place Brewery and I was making the Kilt Lifter, we would add 4 to 6% smoked peated barley from Scotland, and it added this wonderful taste into the beer. This here at Copperworks reminded me of that beer, but in a different way, a little more campfirey than those phenols, those sort of Band-Aid antiseptic flavors that come from the Scottish peat. The flavors are always dependent on what the plant matter was that created the peat. So after we boiled and fermented and conditioned, then we had to distill. In distilling, you have cuts that you make, heads, hearts, and tails. Again, we've got a whole story out on that, so you can listen to that for some more detail. But we wanted to make sure that we were maximizing the peat flavor, so a little bit longer tails cut. We then took that product, put it in the most neutral barrel that we could that still had a char. So it had a number 1 char. Out of the 4 different chars, 1 is the lightest, 4 is the heaviest. We usually use 1, 2s, and 3s. We never use a 4 for whiskey. 1s provide less less barrel flavor to the whiskey, but also stay out of the way of things like malt and peat. So we were putting it in a number 1 barrel. If you're ever interested in reading the specifications of any of our whiskeys, so this is our 34th release, you can go out to copperworksdistilling.com, look into the underneath whiskeys, so products and whiskeys. You'll see our current releases and then past releases. Each one of those will have a spec sheet. They're usually a PDF of 3 to 7 pages. Each page will tell you about the brewing, the distilling, the barrels, the blending of those barrels, the final proof, how many bottles we got, and everything in between. So you'll be able to learn just about as much data as we collect by looking at those spec sheets. That's just a little side note. So when this had been in for 3 years, it was really getting good. It had become a mature whiskey, but we actually left it in for just a little bit longer, actually a little over 4 years. And there was a couple of reasons for that. First of all, we wanted to see how it progresses. This was new to us. Secondly, is we really wanted to try to release this whiskey at the same time that Westland was going to release their whiskey. Since they helped discover it, it thought it would be very nice to partner together. COVID put some changes in our plans, and it looks like Westland is going to be a couple of years out from releasing theirs. So we released ours now, and I tell you, it's really a delicious whiskey. It's probably one of the best whiskeys we've ever released, and it has some really fascinating characters to it. Jeff is going to talk more about it next week, so I encourage you to go there. As always, these will be posted on Instagram Live in the archives, but also on YouTube. So if you want to take a look at this, if you missed part of it, it'll be out there. And you can always write us at copperworksdistilling.com, info@copperworksdistilling.com, and we'll be happy to answer questions for you. Thanks so much. We'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.